Postcolonialism deals with the historical ideas of colonialism, imperialism, cultural domination, and subservience. Some of the major areas of concern are the Americas, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Imperial powers like England and France, and cultural powerhouses like the United States, to name a few, have all engaged in some kind of colonialism or imperialism throughout their history. Postcolonialists want to look at the culture that is left over after these powers have left the countries that they once occupied. Postcolonial theory began with the publication of Edward Said's 1978 novel, Orientalism. This book describes the way studies of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa were, and possibly still are, built on the imperialist systems of the West. The movement then grew to look at the way indigenous people adapted to the culture that oppressed them, the elements of their traditional culture that survived, and the ways moving forward that they should express or retrieve who they were. Some popular postcolonialists include Gayatri Spivak, who was born in Calcutta, India. One of her major topics is that she asks whether the subaltern, or the group without power, even has the ability to speak in a system. Derek Gregory, a United Kingdom author and geographer, argues that the systems of United States and British colonialism are still happening today. Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian author, wrote one of the first African novels about his traditional culture. It laid the groundwork for generations that would follow him and inspired a genre of writing about African culture. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a Kenyan, originally wrote in English but now writes in Gikuyu, his traditional language. Debates within this field often take the form of arguing which system is correct and how to move forward. For example, Achebe and Ngugi both disagree on whether to write in English or not. Achebe believes it makes literature accessible and helps encourage expression, but Ngugi argues that any system left over by the oppressor still allows the oppressor to dominate. So, moving forward, postcolonial literary theory examines the way that writers from colonized countries try to write about and celebrate their cultural identities, reclaiming them from the powers that once colonized them. From the text that we read, we see that there are elements or questions in at least two of them, likely more, that have to do directly with postcolonial literary theory. For example, in Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, there are elements that deal with the duality of Junior's identity and the two worlds he feels pulled between. He celebrates parts of his Native American heritage and culture, but he also detests it and wants to separate himself from that world. At the same time, he embraces aspects of white culture, but has enough distance to simultaneously critique it. We also see it in The Tempest, which has very obvious post-colonial elements in the character of Caliban. Through him, we see one culture, Prospero's, dominate and rewrite Caliban's identity so that he must conform. Despite this, parts of Caliban's original identity still seep through. Some not that great, but some very valuable. This theory would seek to understand Caliban's origin and his mother, the gods he celebrates, and the ways he is inherently different from the Europeans he interacts with. When looking at a text through a postcolonialism lens, there are a few helpful questions to ask of that text. For example, with The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, you can ask, who is the oppressor? Historically, the oppressor of Native Americans would be the American government because Native Americans had to change their culture to fit into reservation life. However, in this text, Junior is in some ways oppressed by Native culture because of the pressure to conform to tribal culture and status quo. You can also ask, who is the oppressed? In this text, it is Junior, but also anyone who lives on the reservation. We may ask, what is the culture that is built? And we see reservation life, a broken culture that white people forced upon natives, exhibited by drinking, bad schooling, and less opportunity of choice and potential. And finally, what elements of their traditional culture shine through? we see the humor that Sherman Alexie uses in his writing and the traditional customs that Junior experiences and lives through in the text. Postcolonial literary theory is both important in a modern sense and while looking at historical texts. As we saw, writing about cultural identity and dual identities is especially relevant for marginalized groups as they are finally given a voice in the national canon. In the United States, Native American writers attempt to come to terms with who they are in the aftermath of a system of cultural erasure. In Africa, Black writers are attempting to revive their culture after European powers have fled their countries. Historically, many texts contain elements of oppressor versus oppressed that have hitherto been ignored, because there was no group that cared to look at them. In The Tempest, Caliban acts as a model for any non-dominant group that is overwritten by another culture. This theory allows us to look at both of these areas with a new light and celebrate the cultures that exist in the world and that those have been erased.